Good evening, dear friends, and welcome back. Tonight, we step away from the warmth of the fireside and into something altogether colder, something darker. Imagine a great English estate, blanketed in fresh winter snow. The moon, full, bright, merciless, hangs above it like a lantern that refuses to look away. No shadows to hide in, no corners left unlit. And yet, beneath that very moon, in that very snow, a man lies dead, stabbed, alone, in a garden where no other footprints exist. How? That is the question that will haunt every room of Blackmore Hall tonight. Fortunately, one small, precise, rather fastidious Belgian gentleman has arrived for the weekend. He did not come looking for murder. Murder, it seems, came looking for him. This is Hercule Poirot and Murder Beneath the Winter Moon. Shall we begin? The House That Winter Forgot. The snow had begun falling some time after midnight, and by the time the first grey light of morning crept across the moors, Blackmore Hall stood buried in it. It was not an unpleasant sight, quite the contrary. The old stone manor wore its white covering with a certain dignity, the way a dowager empress might wear an ermine stole. The yew hedges along the eastern garden had become soft, rounded shapes, their sharp edges gone. The fountain in the center of the courtyard, a rather grim bronze Neptune that no one had ever particularly liked, had been mercifully obscured beneath a smooth dome of snow. Even the iron gate at the end of the long gravel drive, which habitually shrieked on its hinges, had been silenced, muffled, as though the world itself had decided, just for one weekend, to hold its breath. Hercule Poirot stood at the tall drawing-room window and looked out at all of this with considerable unease. He had not wanted to come. He was, if he was being honest with himself, and Poirot made it a strict personal policy to be honest with himself at least twice a day, he was tired. Not the simple tiredness of a man who has walked too far or slept too little. It was a deeper tiredness, the kind that settles into the bones sometime after 60 and refuses, absolutely refuses, to be argued with. His feet ached from the drive up from London. His moustaches, which he kept in a state of immaculate waxed perfection under normal circumstances, had suffered somewhat during the journey. He had attempted to correct them twice in the motor car using a small pocket mirror and had given up after the second attempt when the car struck a rut in the lane and the mirror had jabbed him rather firmly in the chin. He touched his chin now, absently, and continued to look out at the snow. Behind him, the drawing-room of Blackmore Hall was doing its level best to appear cheerful. A fire had been built up in the great stone hearth. Silver candlesticks, 8 of them, which Poirot felt was perhaps 2 more than strictly necessary, lined the mantelpiece. Someone had arranged winter berries in a crystal bowl on the central table, red against white, which was either festive or ominous depending on one's disposition. Poirot, at this particular moment, found himself inclining toward the latter. He had been invited by his old acquaintance, Sir Edmund Ashworth, the owner of Blackmore Hall, and a man of considerable fortune and considerably less tact. Sir Edmund collected things, paintings, wine, rare books, and, it appeared, weekend guests. The invitation had arrived on a Tuesday. Do come, Poirot. Good company, excellent cellar, and the cook does a pheasant that would make you weep. Poirot did not particularly care for pheasant. He had accepted anyway, partly out of politeness, and partly because his London rooms had felt very small and very quiet that week, in a way he did not entirely enjoy. He had not anticipated the snow. He had not anticipated either quite so many guests. There were 7 of them in total, not counting Sir Edmund himself, and of course Poirot. The first to make themselves known, as such people invariably do, were Colonel and Mrs. Hartley. The Colonel was a broad, red-faced man who had served somewhere in the East 30 years ago and had been dining out on the experience ever since. He spoke loudly, laughed at his own observations, and had already, within the first hour of arrival, managed to disagree with 3 separate people on 3 separate subjects. His wife, Margaret, was a thin, careful woman with sharp eyes, and the particular stillness of someone who has spent decades learning to make themselves invisible beside a noisy man. She watched everything. She said very little. Poirot noticed her immediately and filed her away in a corner of his mind marked "interesting." Then there was Mr. Gerald Vane, who was Sir Edmund's solicitor and who wore that professional designation like armor. He was perhaps 50, precise in his movements, with the kind of face that gave nothing away as a matter of professional habit. He had arrived carrying a leather briefcase which he had not put down once, not even at dinner, and which he rested now against the leg of his chair, with the protectiveness of a man guarding something he wished no one would ask about. Miss Lydia Carew was the surprise of the party, or rather, Poirot suspected, she intended to be. She was perhaps 35, handsome in an angular way, with dark haircut, fashionably short, and an air of deliberate unconventionality about her. She announced to the room within minutes of arriving, a sculptress. She had met Sir Edmund at an exhibition in Chelsea. She found the countryside devastating in the most wonderful sense, and had brought, she said, her sketchbook. Poirot found her slightly exhausting, but was careful not to show it. Dr. Philip Soane was the local physician, a quiet, grey-haired man in his late 50s who seemed faintly puzzled to find himself among this particular assembly. He had the unhurried manner of a country doctor, a man accustomed to waiting rooms and long drives down farm lanes, and he sat in his armchair with the calm of someone who has seen most of what life has to offer and found it, on balance, manageable. And then there was Mr. Oliver Ashworth, Sir Edmund's nephew. He was 28, perhaps 29, with his uncle's broad build, but none of his uncle's ease. He moved through the room as though he was not entirely certain he had been meant to be invited. He drank his sherry quickly. He stood near the fire when the others clustered at the window. He was the sort of young man, Poirot thought, about whom one forms no immediate opinion, and that, in Poirot's considerable experience, was never quite as innocent as it appeared. Dinner that evening was long and, on the surface, pleasant. The cook did indeed do something remarkable with the pheasant, though Poirot contented himself mainly with the soup and the bread roll and the rather good burgundy which Sir Edmund poured with a generous hand. The conversation moved, as conversation at such gatherings tends to, across the surface of things. The weather, the roads, whether the old mill on the far edge of the estate might be converted into something useful. Colonel Hartley had opinions on all of it. Miss Vane offered no opinions whatsoever. Miss Carew spoke brilliantly about 3 things she knew a great deal about, and 2 things she did not, which was, Poirot reflected, a ratio more or less consistent with the general population. It was only Oliver Ashworth who was quiet. He ate little. He refilled his wine-glass twice. Once, when Sir Edmund made a passing remark about the estate's future, something about the East Wing and certain necessary decisions, Oliver's hand tightened almost imperceptibly around the stem of his glass. Almost imperceptibly, Poirot noticed. Outside, beyond the curtained windows, the snow continued to fall. The moon had risen, enormous, pale, and absolutely clear, and by the time the party retired for the evening, it lay full and bright across the garden, illuminating every inch of the white ground below with the cool, impartial light of something that has no interest whatsoever in human affairs. Beautiful, Poirot thought, pausing at the top of the stairs to glance from the landing window. Quite beautiful. He went to bed. He did not sleep well. What the moon revealed. It was Mrs. Hartley who found him. She had not intended to. She was not, by nature or habit, the sort of woman who went wandering about snow-covered gardens at 6:30 in the morning. But Margaret Hartley had not slept well. Her husband's snoring had seen to that, as it had seen to it for 31 years. And some time before dawn, she had given up the pretense of rest, wrapped herself in her wool dressing gown, and her heavier overcoat on top of that, pulled on her galoshes, and gone downstairs for air. She had stood for a moment in the doorway of the east wing, the one that opened directly onto the garden terrace. The cold had hit her immediately, sharp and clean, the particular cold of a winter morning that has not yet decided to become a winter day. The sky was still that deep, uncertain blue that exists for perhaps 20 minutes between true darkness and true dawn, and the moon, that great, indifferent moon, was still up, still bright, hanging low now toward the western tree line, but casting its light across the garden with extraordinary clarity. It was the moonlight, in fact, that showed her everything. The garden was immaculate. That was the first thing she registered, and she registered it with the mild, appreciative pleasure of someone who has always been neat by disposition. The snow lay absolutely undisturbed across the whole of the formal garden. The low box hedges, the gravel paths beneath their white covering, the stone sundial at the garden's center, everything smoothed and sealed and perfect. Not a mark on it, not a footprint, not a scrape, not even the small dotted trail of a bird or a fox. Just white, unbroken, silent. And in the middle of it, perhaps 15 feet from the sundial, Sir Edmund Ashworth lay face down in the snow. Margaret Hartley looked at him for a long moment. She was not a woman who screamed. She had never been a woman who screamed. She assessed the situation with the particular clarity that sometimes comes, unexpectedly, in moments of shock. The stillness of him, the wrong angle of his left arm, the darkness in the snow beneath his chest that was not a shadow. And then she turned, went back inside, climbed the stairs at a pace that was brisk without being undignified, and knocked firmly on the door of Hercule Poirot. Poirot had in fact been awake. He had been lying in the rather too soft bed that Blackmore Hall provided its guests, staring at the ceiling and thinking about nothing in particular, which was unusual for him, and which he attributed to the tiredness and the unfamiliar sounds of the house settling around him in the dark. When the knock came, he was almost grateful for it. He was not grateful for what came after. He dressed quickly, not as quickly as a younger man might have. He acknowledged to himself with a certain resignation and followed Mrs. Hartley downstairs. She told him what she had seen in 4 sentences. No embellishment, no hysteria, no repetition. He revised his assessment of her upward considerably. By the time they reached the east wing door, a pale grey dawn had begun to establish itself, and the moon had faded to a dim and ghostly disk above the tree line. It was still bright enough. It was more than bright enough. Poirot stepped out onto the stone terrace and stopped. He stood very still for almost a full minute, his eyes moving slowly, methodically, across every inch of the scene before him. The garden was perhaps 40 feet across at its widest point. The terrace ran along the full length of the east wing. A low stone balustrade separated the terrace from the garden proper, with 3 stone steps leading down at the center. The garden was bounded on the far side by the tall yew hedge, perhaps 8 feet high, dense and dark, and on the left and right by the stone walls of the east and north wings respectively. There was one gate in the yew hedge, Poirot noted, iron, closed, and the snow covered everything. The steps, the garden paths, the sundial plinth, the ground between the hedges and the walls, all of it, every surface, every inch, lay smooth and white and absolutely, completely undisturbed, except for Sir Edmund. He lay approximately 18 feet from the bottom of the steps, face down, his right arm extended, his left arm bent beneath him at an angle that suggested he had fallen heavily and suddenly and had not moved since. He wore his evening clothes still, the dinner jacket, the white shirt, now stained dark at the back where the wound was, and no overcoat, no hat, no galoshes. He had come out here, or been brought out here, in his dinner clothes, and there were no footprints, not leading to him, not leading away, not his own, not anyone else's. The The snow between the terrace steps and Sir Edmund's body was as smooth as a fresh-pressed tablecloth. Poirot could see this with perfect clarity in the grey morning light. He could see the faint texture of snowfall, the very slight crystalline surface that undisturbed snow develops overnight, unbroken in every direction. He stood on the terrace and looked at this for a long time. Eh bien, he thought, with a feeling that was not quite irritation and not quite admiration, but something uncomfortably between the two. Someone has been very clever. Dr. Soane confirmed it within 10 minutes of being roused. The wound was a single stab, deep, precise, delivered from behind. The instrument had not been left in the body. Death, the doctor estimated, had occurred sometime between midnight and 3 in the morning. By 7 o'clock, the full household had assembled in the drawing room. The snow, it quickly became apparent, had sealed them in. The lane from the hall to the main road was impassable. The local police, a Sergeant Grimes from the village, had been reached by telephone and had indicated, with admirable understatement, that he would arrive as soon as conditions permitted. This was interpreted, correctly, as meaning several hours at least. Poirot looked around the room. Colonel Hartley was standing by the fire, his face very red, his voice very loud, offering the opinion that this was a shocking business, and that something ought to be done immediately, though he did not specify what. His wife sat in her usual chair and watched the room. Mr. Gerald Vane sat with his briefcase. Poirot noted that the man's hands, resting on the leather, were quite steady. Miss Carew had dressed with surprising speed and sat curled in the window seat with her sketchbook. Though she was not drawing, she was watching Oliver Ashworth. Oliver Ashworth stood near the door. He had the look of a man who has received news he has been, somewhere in the back of his mind, half expecting. His face was pale. His jaw was set. He was not crying, but there was something around his eyes, some tightness, that Poirot read carefully and did not immediately categorize. Dr. Soane sat quietly. He had, in the way of country doctors, already moved past the shock and into the practical. Poirot poured himself a cup of coffee from the sideboard. It was slightly too weak, which was unfortunate, and turned to face the room. No footprints, he thought again, in snow that had been falling since midnight and had stopped by 3, in a garden with walls on 2 sides and a sealed hedge on the 3rd, and the victim came out in his evening clothes. He sipped his coffee. His feet still ached from yesterday's drive. Nevertheless, he told himself firmly, the little grey cells do not ache. The little grey cells are not tired. The little grey cells have work to do. He set down his cup. Mesdames et messieurs, he said quietly, and the room fell still. Perhaps you will permit me to ask a few questions. The art of asking questions. Poirot had a method. It was not, he was the first to admit, a method that everyone appreciated. It was not dramatic. It did not involve magnifying glasses or muddy knees, or crawling about on the floor examining carpet fibers. Though he had nothing against carpet fibers in principle, his method was quieter than that. It was, at its core, simply this. He talked to people. He listened to what they said. He listened, perhaps more carefully, to what they did not say. And then he thought. He began with Oliver Ashworth. Not because Oliver was the most obvious suspect, though he was, undeniably, the most obvious suspect. The nephew, the heir, presumably, to whatever Sir Edmund had left. The young man who had gone quiet at dinner when his uncle mentioned necessary decisions. Poirot had learned long ago that beginning with the obvious was not always wise, but that ignoring the obvious entirely was a form of vanity he could not afford. He found Oliver in the library, standing at the window, staring out at the garden, at the snow, at the place where his uncle's body had been, before Dr. Soane and the Colonel between them had carried it inside with considerably more effort than grace. "You will forgive me," Poirot said, settling himself into one of the leather chairs without waiting to be invited. If I ask you one or two small questions. Oliver turned from the window. In the morning light, he looked younger than he had at dinner. Also, more tired. Go ahead, he said. You slept well last night? A pause. No. You heard nothing? No movement in the house, no door, no… I said I didn't sleep well. I didn't say I heard anything. Oliver looked at him steadily. I lay awake. I didn't hear a thing. And your uncle? You were close. Something moved across Oliver's face. Something complicated and unresolved. The kind of expression that belongs to relationships which contain both genuine feeling and genuine grievance. We were family, he said finally. That is not quite the same thing. No, Oliver agreed after a moment. It isn't. Poirot nodded slowly. Your uncle mentioned something at dinner. About the East Wing. About certain decisions. You reacted, I think, to this. Oliver's jaw tightened. My uncle had been talking for 2 years about selling part of the estate. The East Wing, the North Field, possibly the whole property eventually. He stopped, pressed his lips together. He had debts. More than anyone knew. Mr. Vane could tell you more than I can. And you objected to the sale. This house has been in my family for 140 years, Monsieur Poirot. The words were quiet, but not quiet at all. Underneath. Yes, I objected. Poirot looked at him for a moment longer than was quite comfortable. Then he rose, thanked the young man pleasantly, and went to find Mr. Vane. The solicitor was still in the drawing room. He had, Poirot noticed, finally put the briefcase down, though it was against his ankle, and his ankle was pressed against it, which amounted to approximately the same thing. Mr. Vane, Poirot said, sitting across from him with the air of a man settling in for a perfectly ordinary conversation. You came this weekend on professional business. I think, not merely as a guest. Vane looked at him with the expression of a man who has decided how much to say and will not be moved from it. Sir Edmund asked me to bring certain documents for his signature. Documents relating to the estate, among other things. The sale of the East Wing? A fractional pause. There were several matters under discussion. Poirot smiled pleasantly. But the sale was the primary one. Vane said nothing, which was itself a kind of answer. Tell me, Poirot continued, was Sir Edmund a man who changed his mind easily? Once he had decided upon a course of action, was he flexible? Edmund Ashworth, Vane said carefully, was one of the most stubborn men I have encountered in 30 years of practice. Ah, Poirot nodded. And had he signed these documents before last night? No. Vane's eyes were level and entirely unreadable. He had not. I see. And now? Now, Vane said, that is a matter for the courts to determine. He picked up his briefcase and placed it in his lap. The conversation, he indicated by every possible means short of saying so, was over. Poirot thanked him and went to find Colonel Hartley. The colonel was the easiest interview and the least useful, which was often the way with the loudest men in any room. He had been asleep, deeply, comprehensively, and, his wife would confirm, audibly asleep, from 11 o'clock until Margaret had woken him at 6:30 with the news of Sir Edmund's death. He had no information to offer and a great deal of noise to make about it. Poirot listened patiently, extracted nothing of value, and escaped after 12 minutes by expressing admiration for a rather ugly hunting print above the fireplace, which sent the colonel into a lengthy reminiscence that required no further participation from Poirot whatsoever. In the corridor outside, he paused. He was, he admitted to himself, tired. His back had begun to ache in addition to his feet, which he felt was excessive. He would have given a great deal for a proper cup of coffee, not the weak, tepid apology that Blackmore Hall's kitchen had provided that morning, but a real cup, dark and strong and hot, the kind he made himself at home, with the small copper pot he had brought from Belgium 30 years ago, and which he still used every morning without exception. He did not have that cup of coffee. He straightened his back, adjusted his moustaches, and went to find Miss Carew. She was in the morning room, and she was, in fact, drawing now. Quick, confident strokes in a large sketchbook. Her head bent over it with the total absorption of someone for whom the act of drawing is also the act of thinking. She looked up when Poirot entered and did not appear surprised. "I wondered when you'd get to me," she said. "You were watching Mr. Oliver Ashworth this morning," Poirot said, sitting down. "In the drawing room, quite intently." She considered denying it, decided against. "Oliver and I knew each other before this weekend. We met in London 18 months ago. We were," she chose her word with care, "friends." "Were? Possibly. I'm not entirely sure." She looked down at her sketchbook. "He didn't know I'd been invited this weekend. He was surprised to see me. Not unpleasantly, I think, but surprised. And Sir Edmund? Did he know of this friendship?" Miss Carew smiled, but it was a careful smile. Edmund knew everything that happened in his nephew's life. He made it his business to. She paused. "He did not approve of me. He thought I was—" Another careful pause. "An unsuitable influence. Did this concern you?" "It concerned Oliver considerably more than it concerned me." She looked up then, directly. "Monsieur Poirot, I did not kill Edmund Ashworth. I had no reason to. Whatever complications existed in Oliver's relationship with his uncle, they were not mine. And last night, after dinner, I went to my room at 10:30. I read until midnight. I slept." She held his gaze. "I sleep very well, as a rule. I find a clear conscience assists enormously." Poirot studied her for a moment. "You are," he said, "quite remarkably composed for someone in the middle of a murder investigation." She smiled again, genuinely this time. "I sculpt, Monsieur Poirot. I spend my days staring at things until I understand their true shape. It is not so different from what you do, I think." Poirot was quiet for a moment. Then, almost to himself, "Non, it is not so different." Dr. Soane was the last. He was in the small study off the entrance hall, and he had found Sir Edmund's decanter of brandy, which Poirot felt, under the circumstances, was entirely forgivable. He offered Poirot a glass. Poirot declined. "You examined the body carefully," Poirot said. "I did. One wound, from behind. The instrument withdrawn." "Yes." "A long blade? Short?" Soane considered. "Medium. 6 inches, perhaps 7. Something narrow." "Not a kitchen knife. Too clean an entry. A letter opener? Possibly, though it would need to be a heavy one. More likely a hunting knife or a—" He paused. "There's a set of ornamental daggers in the billiard room. Have you looked at those?" Poirot had not. He filed this away with a small private reprimand to himself. He should have looked at those. "The time," he said. "You said midnight to 3. Closer to 1 or 2, I'd say, if you push me. The body temperature, the degree of—" "Yes, 1 to 2 in the morning, most likely. And the snow stopped at approximately 3, Poirot murmured. "So the body was placed, or the man walked, into the garden before the snow stopped falling." "Yes, but not recently before, because the snow on and around the body had also settled. He had been there for some time when the snow ceased." Soane looked at him. "That's right. I noticed that too." Poirot nodded slowly, stood, and thanked the doctor. He walked back down the corridor toward the drawing room. The house was quiet around him. Outside, the snow had begun again. Light, thin flakes drifting past the windows without urgency. 1 to 2 in the morning, he thought. No footprints. No weapon. Evening clothes. And a garden with walls on 2 sides. A high yew hedge on the 3rd. And a sealed iron gate. He stopped walking. Something had just occurred to him. Something small. Something he should have thought of 20 minutes ago and had not. Which was, he acknowledged with a certain irritation at himself, not ideal. He turned and walked, rather more quickly now, back toward the east wing. He needed to look at the gate. The gate and the grey cells. The gate was exactly as Poirot had last seen it. Iron, old, perhaps 4 feet wide, set into the yew hedge at the garden's far end. A simple latch mechanism, the kind that lifts from either side, and beneath the latch, a bolt, drawn across, firmly. Poirot stood on the terrace and looked at it from a distance first, in the way he always preferred to look at things, from far enough away that the detail did not distract from the whole. Then he descended the stone steps carefully, planting each foot on the step itself rather than the snow-covered edge, and walked along the terrace's stone border, where the overhang of the roof had kept the ground clear, until he reached the garden's left wall. He could not, of course, walk across the garden. That much was obvious. The snow was undisturbed, and he intended it to remain so. Instead, he moved along the very edge, where the wall met the ground, keeping to the narrow strip of bare stone at the wall's base, where the snow had not quite reached, and made his way, somewhat awkwardly, he would have admitted if anyone had been watching, which thankfully no one was. Around the garden's perimeter to the gate, he examined the bolt. It was drawn across fully. The metal was cold. Of course it was cold. Everything was cold. But there was something else, a faint roughness on the bolt's shaft that his gloved fingers detected as he ran them along it. He leaned closer. There were scratches, very fine, very slight, the kind that accumulate on a bolt over years of use. Nothing that indicated recent or forced movement. He stood up, and his back made its opinion of this known. He ignored it. He looked at the bolt more carefully, then at the gate itself, the hinges, the frame where it met the hedge, the ground immediately beneath it on both sides. The snow on the garden side came right up to the gate's base without interruption. On the outer side, a narrow path ran along the outside of the hedge. The snow was similarly unmarked. The gate had not been opened. Not last night. Not recently. He was certain of it. So, no footprints in the garden, no disturbance at the gate. Walls on 2 sides, solid stone, 8 feet high, with no footholds that he could see. The terrace steps the only other access point, and the snow between the steps and the body as smooth as a mirror. Then how? Poirot asked himself, with a flash of something that was not quite frustration, but was its near neighbor. Did he get there? He was still turning this question over in his mind 40 minutes later when he made his mistake. He had returned to the drawing room, accepted another cup of the inadequate coffee, and stood at the window watching the snow. He was thinking about the wound, the single clean wound, the blade withdrawn, and about the absence of the weapon, and about the sequence of events as he currently understood them. And he was, he realized, making an assumption, a quiet, comfortable, entirely unexamined assumption that he had been carrying since the moment Mrs. Hartley had knocked on his door. He had been assuming that Sir Edmund had been killed elsewhere and brought to the garden. It was the logical conclusion. No footprints meant no one had walked there. No one had walked there meant the body had been carried or placed. And if the body had been placed… But wait. He stopped. He put down the coffee cup. He went back over the snow. In his mind, precisely, the terrace, the steps, the smooth, unbroken surface extending 18 feet to Sir Edmund's body. No footprints at all, he thought. Not even Sir Edmund's own. If the man had been carried, even carried, there would be footprints. The carrier's footprints at minimum, unless, and here was the assumption he had not examined, unless the carrying itself had somehow left no mark. And then there was the second thing. The thing Dr. Soane had confirmed. The snow on and around Sir Edmund's body had settled. The man had been there for some time while the snow was still falling, which meant… Poirot sat down abruptly in the nearest chair. He had been thinking about this incorrectly, not entirely incorrectly. The core facts were right, but he had been approaching it from the wrong direction. He had been asking how the killer left no footprints. He should have been asking something slightly but crucially different. He had been, he acknowledged to himself with the particular displeasure of a man who prides himself on precision, sloppy. It was the tiredness. It had to be the tiredness. He sat very still for perhaps 5 minutes. The fire crackled. Outside, the thin snow continued to fall. Then, slowly, something began to arrange itself. The ornamental daggers in the billiard room were a set of 6, Turkish, Poirot judged, probably mid-19th century, mounted on a board of dark velvet behind glass. Decorative rather than functional. The blades had not been sharpened in decades, if ever, but the case, when he examined it, held only 5. The 6th mount was empty. The velvet around it was slightly less faded than the velvet beneath the other 5, which meant the missing piece had been removed relatively recently. Not years ago. Weeks, perhaps. Possibly days. Poirot looked at this for a long time. Then he looked at the window of the billiard room. It faced north, onto the narrow path that ran along the outside of the yew hedge, the path he had noted when examining the gate. He did not open the window. He did not need to. He simply stood and looked at it, and at the distance from the window to the hedge, and at the angle, and he began, for the first time since Mrs. Hartley had knocked on his door, to see the shape of it. Not all of it. Not yet. 2 or 3 pieces were still absent, and they were not small pieces. But the outline, the essential, underlying structure of what had been done here, was beginning, slowly and with the particular reluctant clarity of a photograph developing in a darkroom, to emerge. Clever, he thought again. Oh, yes. Someone has been very clever indeed. But not, he was beginning to think, quite clever enough. He found he needed air. This surprised him. Poirot was not generally a man who needed air. He was, if anything, a man who preferred warmth and enclosure and the reliable indoors. But his mind was working now in that particular accelerated way that required movement, and movement in the drawing room or the corridor was impossible without someone appearing and speaking to him, which he could not at this moment afford. He went out through the front door, onto the main drive, where the snow had been partially cleared by the wind, and walking was possible. He walked slowly, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes on the ground, his mind entirely elsewhere. The missing dagger, the settled snow, the bolt on the gate, scratched with use, yes, but drawn fully across. The billiard room window facing the north path. Oliver Ashworth's face at dinner, tightening around the stem of his wineglass, Vane's briefcase and the unsigned documents inside it. Miss Carew watching Oliver across the drawing room with something that was not quite anxiety and not quite guilt, but lived in the same neighborhood, as both, and Sir Edmund himself, a stubborn man, according to his own solicitor, a man who had come outside in his evening clothes, in the dark, in the cold, without a coat. Why? Poirot thought. Why would a man do that? Because he was called, because someone had given him a reason compelling enough to override the cold, the hour, the lateness of the evening. A note, perhaps, a message, something that could not wait. Or, and here was the thought that stopped him mid-step on the gravel drive, because he was not called at all. Because he had gone out of his own accord, for his own purpose, to meet someone he had himself arranged to meet, someone he trusted, or someone he wished to confront. Poirot stood still in the cold, the grey cells, as he privately called them, that precise and private machinery of the mind that had never yet failed him, though it had occasionally taken longer than he would have liked, were very busy now. He could almost feel them, working quietly behind everything else, sorting and connecting and discarding. He was nearly there. Not quite, but nearly. He turned and walked back toward the house, moving somewhat faster than before. There was one more thing he needed to confirm, one small detail he needed to verify, and then he would know. He paused at the front door and looked up. The clouds had parted briefly, and the sun, thin, pale, The weak winter sun of an English December had appeared. It lay across the snow of the garden, visible from here, through the gap in the east wing wall, where the old archway was. Poirot looked at the light on the snow, and in that moment, standing at the door of Blackmore Hall, his feet aching, his back complaining, his coffee still weak, and now also cold, Hercule Poirot understood exactly what had happened beneath the winter moon, every piece of it, every last, elegant, carefully constructed piece. He allowed himself, very briefly, a small smile. Then he went inside to find everyone. The shape of an impossible thing. He gathered them in the drawing room at 11:30. It was, Poirot felt, the right room for it. The fire had been built up again. Someone, probably the housekeeper, Mrs. Potts, who had moved through the morning's events with the quiet efficiency of a woman determined that the household should not entirely collapse, and the room was warm and lit, and smelled of wood smoke, and faintly of the pine boughs that had been arranged along the mantelpiece in anticipation of Christmas. The contrast with what Poirot was about to say was not lost on him. He stood with his back to the fireplace. They arranged themselves around the room in the way people do when they are frightened but do not wish to appear so. Colonel Hartley in the largest armchair, his wife beside him, Mr. Vane on the straight-back chair nearest the door, his briefcase across his knees, Miss Carew on the window seat, her sketchbook closed for once, Dr. Soane in the corner with his hands folded, and Oliver Ashworth standing, as he had been standing since the morning, near the door, as though he might need to leave quickly. Poirot looked at them all for a moment. "I will begin," he said, "not with who, but with how, because the how is what has been troubling everyone since this morning. The how is what appears, at first examination, to be impossible. And I have found, in my experience, that once the impossible is explained, the rest becomes—" He paused, searching for the word inevitable. The room was very quiet. Sir Edmund Ashworth was found this morning in the center of his garden. The snow around him was completely undisturbed. There were no footprints, not approaching the body, not leaving it, not anywhere in the garden at all. The gate in the yew hedge was bolted from the inside. The walls are 8 feet of solid stone. And yet there he was, dead, in the middle of the snow. He paused. The question everyone has been asking is, how was the body placed there without leaving a trace? He let the question sit for a moment. But that, he said quietly, is the wrong question. Colonel Hartley made a noise. Poirot continued before it could develop into words. The body was not placed there. Sir Edmund walked there himself. Under his own power, on his own 2 feet, he walked from the terrace steps to the point where he fell. He paused, and he left no footprints, because when he walked there was no snow on the ground. Silence. Miss Carew spoke first. But the snow! It had been falling since midnight. The garden was covered when did you last see the garden before this morning? Poirot asked her. She stopped. At dinner. We looked out at. She paused. It was snowing then, yes, but it had only just begun. Precisely. Poirot turned slightly so he could see the window. The snow began falling at approximately midnight. Sir Edmund died between 1 and 2 in the morning, according to Dr. Soane. At 1 in the morning, the snow had been falling for perhaps 1 hour. 1 hour of light snowfall on a cold night. He held up one finger. Enough to dust the surfaces. Enough to begin to cover the ground. But not, he paused, not enough to have covered it completely. Not enough to have erased the footprints of a man walking across it. He turned back to the room. Sir Edmund walked into that garden at approximately 1 in the morning. He walked under his own power. He left footprints as any man would. He reached the center of the garden, near the sundial, and there he was stabbed, from behind, by someone who had walked out with him, or who was already waiting. Poirot's voice was even, careful, almost gentle. And then the snow continued to fall. For another hour, perhaps two, and it covered everything. The footprints, the traces, all of it. By the time the snow stopped at 3 in the morning, the garden was as smooth and unmarked as if no one had ever set foot in it. The fire crackled. The killer did not perform magic, Poirot said. The killer simply understood something that the rest of us did not think to question. That the snow we saw this morning was not the same snow that existed when the crime was committed. The garden we saw at 6:30 was not the garden of 1 o'clock. Time and snowfall had done the rest. Dr. Soane exhaled slowly. "Good Lord," he said, almost to himself. "Of course. But the snow on the body," Oliver said. His voice was tight. "You said yourself the snow had settled on him, that he'd been there a while." "Yes." Poirot looked at him directly. Sir Edmund was stabbed and fell face down into the snow that existed at that moment. The light, partial snowfall of 1 o'clock. He did not move again. The snow then continued to fall upon him and upon the garden around him for another 1 to 2 hours, settling over everything equally. By 3 o'clock, when the snowfall stopped, the garden appeared entirely undisturbed because it was, in effect, a new layer, a fresh surface laid over the evidence of everything that had come before. He paused. The moon, you see, revealed only what was there at the moment Mrs. Hartley found the body. It revealed the surface. It could not reveal what was beneath it. "The weapon," Miss Carew said quietly. "Ah," Poirot turned. "Yes, the weapon." He reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and produced a small folded piece of paper, which he opened and held toward them, without quite letting anyone take it. It was a rough sketch, drawn in Poirot's own hand, cramped and somewhat inelegant, but precise. In the billiard room there is a mounted display of 6 ornamental daggers. There are now 5. The 6th was removed, I believe within the last week, based on the fading of the velvet beneath the absent piece. He refolded the paper. This dagger was the weapon, and after the crime, it was not carried out of the garden, because that would have required the killer to walk back across the snow that was, by then, beginning to accumulate in a way that would show. Instead, it was removed from the garden by another means entirely. He walked to the window. From here, through the glass, the north face of the yew hedge was visible, and beyond it, just visible, at the right angle, the external path and the wall of the house. The billiard room window, he said, faces the north path. The north path runs directly alongside the outer face of the yew hedge. The hedge itself, at its thinnest point, near the gate, is perhaps 18 inches deep. He turned back. A man standing on the north path, at the right position, could throw a narrow object, a dagger, let us say, over or through the upper branches of the hedge, into the garden. Or, he paused, a man standing inside the garden, near the hedge, could throw the same object back out, over the top, onto the north path, where it could be retrieved at leisure, with no need to enter the garden at all, and then brought back inside through the billiard room window. Dr. Soane said quietly, which was found unlatched this morning. Poirot confirmed. I checked before I came down. The room was very still. Poirot straightened his jacket. His feet still ached. His back still ached. He was aware of being tired in a way that the last 2 hours of concentrated thought had temporarily suspended but not resolved. But his mind was clear. Completely, cleanly, precisely clear. So, he said, looking around the room, we have established the method. The snow fell and covered the evidence. The weapon was disposed of across the hedge. Sir Edmund walked willingly into the garden, which means he went to meet someone he was not afraid of, or someone he had agreed to meet, or both. He paused one final time, which brings us, at last, to the question we have all been avoiding. He looked, very quietly, at Oliver Ashworth. Not how, he said, but who? What the moon always knew. The silence that followed Poirot's words was of a particular quality. It was not the silence of shock, not entirely. It was the silence of a room in which several people had been waiting, with varying degrees of dread and relief, for something to be said aloud that had, until this moment, existed only in the private spaces behind their eyes. Oliver Ashworth did not move from his position near the door. He looked at Poirot for a long moment. Something in his face shifted, not collapsed, not broke, but shifted, the way a carefully maintained expression shifts when the effort of maintaining it becomes, finally, more trouble than it is worth. "You're going to tell me," he said quietly, "that you think I killed my uncle." "I am going to tell you," Poirot replied, with equal quiet, "what I know, and what I know is this." He moved away from the window and stood in the center of the room, equidistant from everyone, which was a habit of his in these moments. He liked to be able to see all faces simultaneously, to watch the small involuntary movements that people make when they believe attention is directed elsewhere. Sir Edmund Ashworth was, by all accounts, a stubborn man, a man who, having decided upon a course of action, did not deviate from it. He had decided to sell this estate, or at minimum significant parts of it. The documents were prepared. Mr. Vane had brought them this weekend specifically for signature. He glanced at Vane, who said nothing. The sale would have provided Sir Edmund with the funds to address considerable private debts. It would also have ended, permanently and irrevocably, any prospect of Oliver Ashworth inheriting the family property intact. Colonel Hartley shifted in his armchair. His wife did not move at all. Oliver had argued against this sale for 2 years. Sir Edmund had not listened, and so Poirot paused. Oliver made a different arrangement. He sent his uncle a note sometime after the household retired. A note asking Sir Edmund to meet him in the garden, privately. A final conversation, perhaps. A last attempt to change the old man's mind. Sir Edmund, who was, whatever else he was, not a coward, agreed. "You're speculating," Oliver said. His voice was still level, almost impressive, Poirot thought. Almost. "I am," Poirot agreed pleasantly. "About the note, yes. I speculate. I have not found it. But then, a man who has planned carefully would have ensured that a note was not findable. What I do not speculate about," his voice shifted almost imperceptibly, "is the rest." He turned slightly toward the room. Oliver knew this house. He had known it since childhood. He knew the billiard room and its contents. He knew the yew hedge and the north path that runs alongside it. He had, I believe, removed the dagger from its mount several days ago, before the other guests arrived, and concealed it, ready. He knew that if snow was forecast, and it had been forecast, the local weather was no secret, and if the crime was committed in the early hours while the snow was still falling, the evidence would be covered by morning. Miss Carew had gone very still on the window seat. She was looking at Oliver with an expression that Poirot found, in its complexity, rather painful to observe. They met in the garden, Poirot continued, his voice remaining even, almost conversational. Sir Edmund and his nephew. Perhaps they spoke. Perhaps Oliver made his final argument, and Sir Edmund refused it, as he had always refused it, with the absolute inflexibility of a man who has made up his mind. And then Oliver, who had positioned himself behind his uncle, near the sundial, where the ground is slightly elevated and the hedge is closest. Poirot paused. Just briefly. Just long enough. Oliver used the dagger. The fire crackled. Sir Edmund fell. Oliver did not panic. He had thought this through too carefully for panic. He threw the dagger over the hedge onto the north path. He walked back to the terrace, his own footprints already beginning to fill with fresh snow, and returned to the house through the east wing door, which he had left on the latch. He retrieved the dagger from the north path through the unlatched billiard room window. He cleaned it. He did not return it to its mount. That would have been too obvious if anyone looked closely, but concealed it somewhere in the house. Poirot looked at Oliver steadily. "I expect, when Sergeant Grimes arrives and conducts a proper search, it will be found." Oliver said nothing. "The snow did the rest," Poirot said, as he had known it would, as he had planned it to. By morning, the garden was perfect, untouched, impossible. He tilted his head very slightly. Except that the snow covered too much. It covered not only his footprints, but Sir Edmund's. And a man who has been murdered in a garden must have walked into that garden somehow. When I asked myself why there were no footprints at all, not even the victims, the answer could only be one thing: time. The snow had fallen after, not before. The room was absolutely silent now. "Oliver," Miss Carew said. "Just his name, nothing else." He looked at her then, for the first time since Poirot had begun speaking. Something passed between them, something old and unresolved, and, Poirot thought, genuinely sorrowful on both sides. "Lydia," he said, "I'm sorry." She looked down at her sketchbook. Oliver turned back to Poirot. He had, in the last 2 minutes, become somehow quieter. Not defeated exactly, but settled, as though a decision had been made that he had been postponing for a very long time. "The estate," he said. "You understand, it wasn't only the money. It wasn't greed." He stopped, pressed his lips together. 140 years. My grandfather, his father before him. My mother grew up here. She's buried in the churchyard at the bottom of the lane. His voice was steady, but had taken on a kind of bleakness that was worse than anger would have been. Edmund was going to sell it to a property developer, to be divided into holiday flats. He said the last 2 words with a quiet, absolute contempt. "Holiday flats." "I understand," Poirot said. And he did, in fact, understand. Not agree, not condone, but understand, which was not the same thing at all. "Nevertheless, Oliver repeated. A long pause. "Yes." Sergeant Grimes arrived at 2:30 that afternoon, when the snow had thinned enough to permit a motor car along the lane, with some difficulty and considerable persistence. He was a solid, sensible man, with the manner of someone who has learned that the most effective thing he can do in any complicated situation is listen carefully and speak sparingly. Poirot found him immediately trustworthy. The dagger was found an hour later, wrapped in a cloth, inside the back of the drawer in Oliver's wardrobe. It had been cleaned with some thoroughness, but not, as Sergeant Grimes noted with professional satisfaction, quite thoroughly enough. Oliver Ashworth made no further denials. He answered the sergeant's questions in the same level, quiet voice he had used with Poirot, and was taken away in the police motor car, just as the thin winter sun was beginning to descend toward the moors, painting the snow in shades of amber and pale rose that were, under the circumstances, almost offensively beautiful. Poirot stood at the drawing-room window and watched the motor car disappear down the lane. Behind him, the room was emptying. Colonel Hartley was talking, of course he was, about the importance of justice and the certainty that he had suspected the nephew from the first, which was not true, but which Poirot saw no particular reason to correct. Mrs. Hartley was already, quietly and without fuss, beginning to organize the packing. Mr. Vane had his briefcase and his coat, and the particular expression of a solicitor who is already calculating the legal implications of the afternoon's events. Dr. Soane paused beside Poirot on his way out. "Remarkable," the doctor said simply. "Not so remarkable," Poirot replied. "The snow fell. The snow told the truth. I merely listened." Soane nodded, put on his hat, and left. Miss Carew was the last. She stood for a moment in the doorway of the drawing-room, her coat on, her sketchbook under her arm. She looked at Poirot with an expression he could not entirely read. Grief, he thought, and something harder than grief. The particular hardness of someone who is deciding, in real time, how much of what they feel they will permit themselves. "Did you know?" she asked. "Before you spoke to us, did you already know it was him?" Poirot considered the question honestly, as he always tried to do. "I knew the shape of it," he said. The details confirmed what the shape suggested. She nodded slowly. "He loved that house," she said. "Whatever else, he truly loved it." "Yes," Poirot said. "I believe he did." She left. Poirot stood alone in the drawing room of Blackmore Hall for a few minutes longer. The fire was burning low. The winter light through the windows had gone from rose to grey. Outside, the garden lay white and still, and entirely, perfectly ordinary. Nothing in it now to suggest that it had been, for a few hours in the very early morning, the site of something terrible. The moon, when it rose that evening, would find it just as it had found it the night before. Bright, cold, revealing everything, knowing nothing. Poirot picked up his coat, his hat, and his small travelling case, and walked, somewhat stiffly, toward the door. His feet, he noted, still ached. Some things, he reflected, not even the little grey cells could fix.